LiSTNR production.
Hey, Bension Siebert here with the briefing. Australia's cost of living crisis is affecting all of us, some of us much more than others. At worst, it's pushing people into homelessness and keeping people, mostly women, trapped in abusive and violent relationships. At the other end of the scale, it's meant people cutting back on things they like to spend money on, going without, and making some hard choices. For many families across Australia, one of those hard choices has been taking their kids out of sport. And for some athletes, it's meant quitting the sport they love to pursue more financially secure options. A recent report from UNICEF Australia found that more than half of Aussie families had to make changes to their household costs to pay for sport or having to take their kids out of sport completely. With the Paris Olympics coming in less than 2 months and Brisbane in 2032, Australia needs the biggest pool of talent it can get. So just how big is the impact of the cost of living crisis on our athletes, and what can be done about it? Tessa Randello from the LiSTNR Newsroom is here with me. Tessa, welcome back to the briefing.
Thank you. Hello.
We know the cost of living is hitting very hard among people who play and facilitate a lot of sport. Research from the University of Melbourne shows that groups most affected by inflation include people aged 18 to 54, singles with and without children, and couples with children. So Tessa, what evidence is out there about the effect of the cost of living crisis on sporting clubs in Australia?
So we don't have heaps that tells us exactly what is happening in terms of cost of living because, of course, COVID had its own impact. So we've got this kind of mix of both coming together. But the Your Sport, Your Say research shows that 1 in 4 Australian sporting clubs were on the brink of collapse from cost of living impacts such as declining registrations, increased operation costs in things like energy bills and food like the rest of us are dealing with, and their reduced volunteer numbers as well. Australia-wide, the number of kids under the age of 15 playing sport is 48% at the moment in the latest data we have from the Australian Sports Foundation. That number was 55% in 2018-19. I talked to Professor Rochelle Imey from Vic Sport, and she says in Victoria they're seeing a drop in participation rates of the 11 to 14-year-olds. And she talks us through why seeing less kids in that age group can be so detrimental.
In a team sport, you might have a 15 and under seniors and a 15 and under reserves. Well, as soon as you don't sort of have quite enough numbers to fill those reserves teams, you've lost that team. You don't then have another cohort of extra under 13s to go fill those spots in a year or two. So it's a ripple effect. It's a bit like the amalgamation of country clubs. Once they sort of lose those teams and no numbers, they amalgamate with another town, and I've never known a town to de-amalgamate. So it's a ripple effect that I don't think you can come back from.
And that obviously ends up affecting the number of athletes that are able to progress. If these kids don't play at the age of 11 to 14, they're probably not going to come back into these sports for the first time as a 17, 18-year-olds per se. There are some people who still can afford to play sports, obviously, but it does start to create a bit of a divide between the kids who can and the kids who can't. Vic Sports Deputy Chair Professor Rochelle Imey says this divide has always kind of existed though.
Well, they're going to be the ones that have more opportunities. And I think too, elite sport, in most sports, there is going to always be a correlation between those that can afford to do it, because as soon as you start playing association and state-based and national and then international, the costs are just exorbitant. So I think there's always a correlation between that, but I think it's the divide's going to be even bigger between those that have an opportunity to play at all and those that don't, unfortunately.
So she's speaking there about Victoria and about kids, but what about nationally and also adult athletes?
So I spoke with Ryan Holloway. He's from the Australian Sports Foundation. He gave us a bit of a better idea into kind of overall and some athletes, how they're kind of dealing with the cost of living crisis. He says, in general, we're seeing Australians cut back. Kids are picking one sport instead of playing every single sport they want to play. And some parents are even ditching the sports that they play so that they can afford for their kids to be playing sports. Data from the Australian Sports Foundation also revealed that 43% of Brisbane hopefuls have considered leaving their sport, and 1 in 2 2026 Com Game hopefuls have also considered leaving. The cost made up half of the top 6 reasons why they are considering leaving those sports, which is pretty hard to hear.
So I guess the big question now, what about the Olympics? Australia has traditionally done pretty well for our population at international sporting competitions, but we've got Paris coming up on July 26th. Is it possible we'll see fewer Aussie athletes there than we have in past Olympics?
It's a little bit hard to say because obviously some of those previous stats have shown just how financially hard it is for athletes to make money in their chosen sport. And obviously these athletes who are heading to Paris are dealing with the cost of living on top of everything else. Everyone's dealing with increased rent, increased costs of electricity and groceries and everything else, and they also have to manage to travel there. There's obviously some very different levels of pay as well when it comes to sporting. I think something interesting that came up recently was when Gina Reinhart wanted a portrait taken down from the National Gallery of her, and a bunch of swimmers came to her defense. And it was really, I guess for some of us who didn't know the background, it was a bit strange, but it was revealed that she's poured around $60 million into swimming, and she's also poured a lot of money into a lot of other sports. A lot of that is giving these swimmers, these athletes, essentially a living wage. And for the new and up-and-coming athletes heading to Paris, that's kind of a struggle that they're having to deal with. Kids who are starting sport now, like those 11 to 14-year-olds who are dropping off in Victoria, could be the next generation for Brisbane as well. And Ryan Holloway, who's the Chief Partnerships Officer for the Australian Sports Foundation, says the cost of living could really have an effect on our Olympic potential.
Right now is when we're seeing, the young athletes of tomorrow really being able to have the opportunity to have that pathway to pave their way to get to an Olympic Games and to represent Australia at a home Olympic Games. So we've got to be really, really conscious of the fact that those pathways start at the community and grassroots level. And what we don't want to do is cost people out of being able to participate in sport, because the last thing we would want is that sport is limited for only those that can afford it. And not our best athletes.
So there's this whole sort of production line of sporting talent in Australia that he just described there, going from the community level all the way up to elite sports. But once you get to that elite level, what's the pay like?
Well, I think there's this belief that athletes at the top level are making really good money because obviously they're the best at their craft on an international level. We all know their names, but I was really surprised to find that that's not the case. The Australian Olympic Committee has a medal incentive scheme, and athletes are paid $20,000 for a gold, $15,000 for silver, and $10,000 for a bronze medal, but they're not paid to just go to the Olympics. And Australian athletes who get that money only get one payment for their best result, and it is conditional on them continuing to train for the next Olympics. Obviously, there are sponsorships and other partnerships that are involved that our athletes can make money through, but it's just not as assured, I guess, as I thought it would have been. The Australian Sports Foundation does do a lot of work with the Australian Olympic Committee, and they actually fundraise to help get some athletes to the Olympic Games. They're currently working with the AOC closely on getting the team to Paris. And Ryan Holloway says that when you think of the best players being paid these massive contracts, they're really just the 1% in terms of sport.
The struggle is for those athletes that are striving to get to that level, to become elite, to become the next Sam Kerr, the next Josh Giddey, the next Paddy Mills, Lauren Jackson, whatever it may be. So there's a lot of pressure on those athletes, and we've seen it not just in the sporting sector, but recently, the arts sector has come out as well, and there's a lot of those people living below the poverty line.
Yeah, that's really kind of jarring to hear these people who are effectively celebrities, who are at the top of their craft, not being paid very much, or at least not being paid very much by the official sources. What else do we know about what's coming up for the Paris Olympics?
So I don't have any data on kind of what Olympians are being paid. Obviously, it does vary completely. Like Ryan mentioned, there are people like Sam Kerr who are on millions of dollars a year, but then there are also people who are going to the Olympics for the first time who might not be. The Australian Sports Foundation did find that 3 in 5 Commonwealth Games hopefuls make less than $23,000 a year on average, and those are from the athletes that they surveyed. So on top of all those other prices going on, groceries, electricity and petrol, and importantly for people who play sport, they also have to deal with a lot of travel costs. Athletes right now are having to grapple with all of those while travelling to Paris, and they may not make a whole lot of money when they get there.
So given all these financial issues that our sports people and kids potentially getting into sport are facing, what does all this say about the future of sport in Australia?
Well, it's not all doom and gloom because I'm going to let Ryan Holloway answer this one. He's still really optimistic about sport here in Australia. While it is getting expensive for people to participate, we still love to watch our favourite sports. An example, the Matildas in the World Cup still sold out stadiums, got some record crowds and continue to sell out some Australian stadiums. And he also said with the inclusion of some new Olympic sports like the success of karate, skateboarding, sport climbing and surfing at Tokyo, and obviously breaking, which is also known as breakdancing, which is coming to Paris, that could also have a really positive impact on what's coming up.
We've got to overcome some of these barriers. I know solving the cost of living crisis is not for the Australian Sports Foundation to cover off, but definitely in terms of being able to make sport more accessible. I think that we've got a real opportunity to be able to engage different pools of funding to assist with that. So I think the future's bright. There are plenty of sports out there and there are so many more sports coming on board. Particularly you look at the success of climbing, for example, now in the Olympic Games, and it's sort of opening up, more of those traditional sort of recreational type activities with a structured sports infrastructure behind them.
Well, that's great to hear. Now, obviously, the cost of living crisis isn't going to be turning around anytime soon, but here's hoping that we'll be seeing more of our Aussie athletes getting involved and hopefully on the podium in Paris and Brisbane. Tessa, thanks so much for bringing us this story and joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Tessa Randello there. That's it for The Briefing today. If you enjoyed today's ep or you like what we do generally at The Briefing, do tell 7 to 10 friends about the show. In the meantime, you can find us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast for a whole bunch of extra insider content from us. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you soon.